What is your absolute breaking point? That moment when you understand viscerally, not intellectually, but on a primal and terrifying level, that the person you love is genuinely, literally, willing to die for you, not as a romantic concept that sounds beautiful in movies, but as a concrete and immediate reality where their body becomes a physical barrier between you and death, where you witness a split-second decision that their life is worth less than yours, where you see with your own eyes a conscious choice of ultimate sacrifice. There comes a specific moment when the abstraction of "I would give my life for you" brutally collides with the reality of a person actively choosing their own death to buy you additional seconds of survival, where theory becomes practice through blood, violence, and absolute terror. For her, that moment arrived on a Tuesday night, 8 months after the nightmare began, with witnessing an execution. 3 months after the resurgent threat was neutralized. Weeks after she had finally begun to believe that the worst was over, and that a normal future was possible, when a coordinated attack that no one had fully anticipated transformed an apartment she was beginning to feel like home into a literal war zone. When seconds exploded into an eternity of terror and violence. When she saw Jake, Sheriff Jake Dawson, the man who had sacrificed his badge and career to protect her when the system failed, who had repeatedly chosen her over his own safety and convenience, who had become not only her protector, but her partner and someone she loved in ways that transcended gratitude, deliberately placing himself in the line of fire not once but multiple times, literally absorbing the impact of a military attack specifically designed to kill her, facing odds that no amount of training, protocol, or sanity would suggest were survivable. Stay with me until the end, because what happened that Tuesday night will show you something fundamental about the devastating difference between promising protection and delivering protection when the cost is your own life, between saying that someone matters and proving through blood and sacrifice that they matter more than breathing, because numbers don't lie about the impossibility of what Jake faced. 5 professional attackers against 1 man. Automatic weapons with hundreds of rounds versus a service pistol with 60 bullets total. Military-level team coordination that trained together versus the improvised defensive strategy of a man operating essentially alone. Body armor on them, vulnerability on his, their meticulous planning versus his 30 minutes of preparation. And Jake didn't back down when he saw the odds. He didn't call for backup and hide waiting for reinforcements to arrive. He didn't prioritize his own survival as any rational tactical analysis would dictate. He consciously, deliberately transformed himself into a human shield, a living obstacle that attackers would have to physically remove before reaching the woman he loved, making the real-time decision that if someone died that night and someone would die given the disparity in strength, it wouldn't be her as long as he still had breath in his body. It wasn't cinematic heroism where a bullet miraculously misses, or where a man overcomes 5 others through superhuman skill. It was calculated sacrifice where Jake perfectly understood that he was offering his own life, that he was buying her time with his blood, that the odds of survival were minimal, but that keeping her alive until backup arrived was the only objective that mattered, even if achieving that objective cost everything. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever witnessed someone who loves to calculate in real time that their life is worth less than yours, that their death is an acceptable price for your safety? Because when the dust literally settled after a shootout that lasted an eternity compressed into brutal minutes, when deafening silence replaced the sound of automatic weapons and screams and destruction, when the smoke began to clear enough to see through it, she saw Jake still standing, miraculously, impossibly, inexplicably still standing, but not intact, bleeding from multiple wounds that should have individually been incapacitating and collectively fatal. Left shoulder where the first round hit, right leg that barely bore weight, side where graze had cut deeply, body armor showing multiple impacts that would have killed instantly if you weren't wearing it. And he was still holding his weapon, still standing between it and where the attackers had been, still maintaining his position even as his body was failing through shock and blood loss. And in that moment of brutal clarity, born of near loss, of witnessing the person she loved standing only by sheer willpower, refusing to collapse until she was sure she was safe, she understood the utterly terrifying depth of his commitment. Jake wasn't just willing to die for her in the abstract, romantic concept people readily declare. He was actively, consciously choosing his own death over allowing hers. He was calculating that his life was acceptable currency to buy seconds of survival for her. He was proving through blood and sacrifice that the promises he had made were not empty words, but literal truth. His love completely transcended anything she had experienced or imagined possible. I love you meant to him, not a comfortable feeling, but an absolute commitment that included ultimate sacrifice if necessary. When he said months ago, "You are not alone as long as I breathe," it wasn't a romantic phrase, but a declaration of intent that he was willing to die proving. And now, with paramedics frantically working to stabilize Jake before transporting him to emergency surgery, with his blood on her hands, and the visceral terror that she could lose him permanently through the sacrifice he made saving her, she had to confront the reality of living. With the knowledge of that moment, of knowing exactly how far he would go, of understanding that next time and there could be a next time because the threat wasn't completely eliminated, he would make the exact same calculation and choose the exact same sacrifice. But to fully understand the magnitude of what happened that Tuesday night, to understand how they reached the point where a coordinated military attack was necessary, you need to know the journey that brought them there, to know who she was before everything fell apart and who Jake became through repeatedly choosing her, to know exactly what kind of enemy would order that kind of attack and why. 8 months before that violent Tuesday night and near loss, she had a life that functioned perfectly within modest but satisfactory parameters. At 32, she worked as a nurse in a community hospital, had a small but cozy apartment, a circle of friends she valued, and a routine that offered stability through predictability. Wasn't an extraordinary or a glamorous life, but it was hers. And she had learned over the years that the ordinary had its own value, that it didn't need drama or intensity for existence to have meaning. A lesson she internalized deeply, to trust only herself, not to depend on others for security or happiness, to build a life she could sustain on her own. She had served herself well through nursing school, which she paid for through multiple jobs, through establishing a career, through competence and dedication, through creating an existence that was stable, if not exciting. And then she witnessed an execution she shouldn't have, seen leaving the hospital after a night shift, walking through a dimly lit parking lot, overhearing a conversation her instinct told her to ignore, but fatal curiosity made her turn around, just as the gunshot cut through her plea of I have a family, young children, a moment that completely changed her life trajectory, that transformed a random nurse into a federal witness, that threw her into a world of protection, threats, and constant terror that she was completely unprepared to navigate. If any of this has ever happened to you, if you've ever witnessed something you shouldn't have, if your normal life has ever evaporated in an instant by being in the wrong place at the wrong time, if you've ever been forced into a situation where the self-sufficiency you've built wasn't enough against the threat you faced, share in the comments. Because recognizing that you're not alone in experiencing a complete disruption of normalcy is the first step in processing the trauma that comes with it. The weeks that followed the execution were a brutal lesson in just how inadequate the witness protection system often was. 2 assassination attempts that nearly succeeded, a supposedly secure phone compromised, family threatened when the organization shifted tactics from attacking her directly to attacking people she loved. And it was during that period of systemic failure that Jake entered her life not as a romantic savior, but as sheriff doing his job, taking over protection after the federal system repeatedly failed her. But something had changed over weeks and months of forced proximity. Jake, who should have been merely a professional protector, maintaining an appropriate distance, had become someone who saw her completely not just as a witness or case, but as a human being with fears, strengths, and vulnerabilities that trauma was exploring. He had become the kind of person who, when she tried to leave to save him from the consequences of protecting her, appeared while she was crying alone and revealed that she was not a burden, but a conscious choice she had made. They had become partners through navigating not only danger, but rebuilding after danger had passed, through choosing each other when it would be easier to leave, through proving that their love wasn't a trauma bond, but a real connection that survived the transition from crisis to normalcy. And in those 8 months, she had begun to believe naively, optimistically, that the worst was over, that Vance being imprisoned meant the threat was neutralized, that a future with Jake was possible without the constant shadow of violence. If this part touched you in any way, if you recognized that moment when you start to believe that the nightmare is finally over and that you can start planning for the future, leave a like so I know you're connected to this journey. Because what she didn't understand, what none of them fully understood until Tuesday night, was that she had profoundly underestimated Marcus Vance's capacity for revenge, his ability to persist beyond logic or self-preservation. Vance wasn't just a criminal who had been arrested based on her testimony. He was the leader of a money laundering organization with an ego that couldn't tolerate defeat, with resources that persisted even from prison, with connections that allowed him to order retaliation, even when retaliation served no practical purpose. Because her testimony had already been given, the case against him was built, and the trial was scheduled regardless of whether she was alive or dead. Eliminating her wouldn't change his legal fate, but in the distorted logic of a man accustomed to absolute control, a random nurse who was in the wrong place, and who contributed to his downfall, had to pay a price. Not out of strategy, but out of principle, out of ego, out of a refusal to accept that a powerless person had contributed to the destruction of his empire. So he ordered her arrest through the connections he maintained. Final elimination. Not threats or deterrence. Professionally coordinated execution. And if you want to follow more stories like this, stories about the moment when you believe the nightmare is over, but discover that revenge doesn't respect logic, about someone willing to literally die protecting you when an attack comes, about the aftermath of surviving violence that should have been fatal, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because what happened when the attack Vance ordered finally came. When Jake received warning with only minutes to prepare, when he had to make the impossible choice of fortifying an inadequate position or risking a move that could result in an ambush, will show you exactly how far his commitment went, how much he was willing to sacrifice, and how that sacrifice changed not only her physical survival, but a fundamental understanding of what his love meant. But first, to understand the impossible decisions Jake made that night, you need to know exactly how the warning arrived, how much time they had to prepare, and why the choice to stay and fight instead of fleeing was less about tactics and more about the brutal recognition that against an opponent with those resources, fleeing would only inevitably delay them, and that confronting them on terrain they at least minimally knew was better than being caught in the act without any preparation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a devastating difference between rebuilding life after trauma, genuinely believing that a terrible chapter has closed, and brutally discovering that it had only been an intermission, that the enemy she thought was neutralized retained sufficient resources and motivation to orchestrate a final attack, that months of beginning to breathe without constant terror were a fragile illusion about to be shattered. For her, that discovery came not gradually but abruptly, without gentle warning, through a phone call that transformed an ordinary Tuesday night into a resurgent nightmare in an instant. 8 months, 240 days, since witnessing a brutal execution in a hospital parking lot that threw a completely organized life into absolute chaos. Since the normalcy he had carefully built through years of self-sufficiency evaporated and was replaced by the existence of safe houses and guards and hypervigilance that never switched off. 3 months 90 days, since the resurgent threat of organization members who escaped initial imprisonment was neutralized through a coordinated operation, since he had finally allowed himself to believe that the worst, genuinely, was over. And in those 3 months, at 32 years old, she had worked incredibly hard to rebuild an existence that had been so completely fragmented. A new job at a hospital in a different city, because returning to her previous position was complicated by the publicity the case had generated, by the fact that colleagues now saw her not as a competent nurse, but as the one who witnessed a murder, with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort that made working together unsustainable. A small apartment, but genuinely hers, not a temporary safe house or a location provided by witness protection, but a space she had chosen, rented, and decorated. The first place in months that felt like home instead of a hideout. A routine that was slowly, painfully beginning to feel normal instead of a temporary performance, waking up without immediately checking windows for threats, walking to work without constantly calculating escape routes, sleeping through the night occasionally without nightmares that had become so frequent that their absence was noticeable. Testifying in multiple trials against members of the organization had been brutal. Just as lawyers had warned, reliving trauma repeatedly for jury hearings, being cross-examined by defense attorneys trying to discredit her by questioning her memory or motivation, enduring public scrutiny where every detail of her life was examined to find inconsistencies that could be exploited. But most of it was complete now. Her legal obligation largely fulfilled, she could begin to move beyond her identity as a federal witness to something more like a normal person. The investigation into Jake's formal process that examined every decision he made over months, protecting her. That questioned his motives and the appropriateness of his actions. That threatened termination and possibly criminal charges, had concluded with a result that was far from ideal but survivable. A 6-month suspension already served during the investigation, a 2-year probation where any violation would result in immediate termination, but not permanent termination, not a definitive end to his career. The possibility of an eventual return to law enforcement remained, albeit tainted by a permanent mark on his record that would always raise questions. Their relationship, tested through months of rebuilding that were in many ways more challenging than the danger that had initially brought them together, had proven to be much more than trauma bond or attachment born of necessity. They had navigated real differences that emerged when adrenaline wasn't masking incompatibilities, he being naturally reserved and processing internally, she needing to verbalize in order to process, creating friction that demanded conscious compromise. They had worked through practical incompatibilities regarding where to live, how to support themselves financially when both were in professional transition, how to balance his need for structure with her spontaneity, small things that seemed trivial during a crisis but accumulated. In daily life, they had consciously chosen each other through multiple moments when leaving would have been easier, when doubt about whether love was real or circumstantial would have justified retreating, when external pressure from concerned family and a judging community suggested that a relationship born of trauma was doomed. It wasn't perfect, far from it. There were still devastating moments of doubt where they both questioned whether they were together for the right reasons or out of inertia and fear of loneliness. There was still constant and exhausting external scrutiny from people who viewed the relationship through a lens of inappropriateness without understanding the full context. There were still visible and invisible scars of trauma that they both carried, her occasional nightmares, his residual hypervigilance, the ways they both jumped at unexpected sounds or became tense in crowds. But it was real in ways that superficial perfection never could be. It was sustainable because it was based not on romantic fantasy but on a complete understanding of who they were, including flaws and vulnerabilities. It was love that had survived a brutal transition from crisis, where intensity masked problems, to normalcy, where problems were inevitable and had to be consciously worked through. She had allowed herself carefully, hesitantly, but genuinely to begin to hope again. To begin planning for a future that included Jake, not as a temporary protector, but as a long-term, possibly permanent partner. To begin to believe that the constant terror of the previous months, the feeling of always looking over her shoulder, expecting the next threat, was finally, genuinely over. That Vance being imprisoned meant the threat was neutralized. That the remaining members of the organization had been arrested or dispersed sufficiently, that retaliation was no longer a real risk. But she had underestimated, dramatically, dangerously, almost fatally Marcus Vance's capacity for revenge, specifically his ability to persist beyond any logic, self-preservation, or strategic calculation. Vance was not just one criminal among many who had been arrested through her testimony. He was the leader of a sophisticated money laundering organization, a man who had built an empire through a combination of intelligence and brutality, who had operated for years undetected because he had the resources to buy protection and silence. Crucially, he had an ego that couldn't tolerate defeat or humiliation, especially not humiliation from someone who was supposed to be insignificant. In his distorted logic, a random nurse who was in the wrong place at the wrong time and who witnessed an execution, who contributed through that testimony to the dismantling of an operation that had taken decades to build, who represented a loss of control and power that defined his identity, had to pay a price. Not strategically eliminating her would serve no practical purpose whatsoever. Her testimony had already been given in multiple trials, was on permanent record, and was corroborated by physical and financial evidence that the investigation had uncovered. The case against him was solidly built. His trial was scheduled for 3 months from now, and the outcome was essentially certain given the weight of the evidence. Killing her now would not change his legal fate in the slightest. But for Vance, it wasn't about tactics. It was about principle, about ego, about a fundamental refusal to accept that someone without power or connections had contributed to his destruction. It was about sending a message, perhaps to himself, perhaps to others who might consider testifying against similar operations, that crossing Marcus Vance had consequences that persisted beyond prison, that his revenge had no statute of limitations or cost-benefit considerations. Then he ordered the arrest through connections he had meticulously maintained, corrupted guards who passed messages, lawyers who served as intermediaries, an outside network that remained loyal through a combination of fear and payment. The final elimination of a witness who had dared to contribute to his downfall. No threat designed to intimidate. No deterrent to future witnesses. Pure execution, retaliation on principle, not strategy, and not an amateur operation improvised by desperate criminals, but a professionally coordinated attack that demonstrated that Vance's resources remained substantial. Even from prison, a team of 5 operators with military training, equipment that included automatic weapons and body armor, and explosives for breaching, coordination that suggested rehearsal and detailed planning, intelligence on her exact location and apartment routine and vulnerabilities. The attack was specifically designed to overcome any reasonable defense she or Jake could mount, to ensure that this time, after multiple previous attempts that failed through a combination of Jake's skill and luck, there would be no failure, no fortuitous escape, no survival. It was an operation designed to be definitive, to eliminate Vance's problem permanently, regardless of the cost in resources or exposure. And she, living in an apartment that was beginning to feel like home, working at a hospital, establishing a new routine, planning a future with Jake that was starting to seem possible, had no idea that this attack was being coordinated, that a timeline had been established, that a specific Tuesday night had been chosen based on intelligence about when she would be home and vulnerable. Comment below. This makes sense to me, when you finally start rebuilding your life and believe the nightmare is over, and discover that the enemy has kept resources for a final attack that comes without warning. It's a shattering of hope that the original trauma never fully caused, because you always knew you were in danger then. But now you had begun to believe you were safe. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific kind of terror that comes not from an abstract or distant threat, but from a concrete warning with a precise timeline between now and midnight that transforms an ordinary night into a countdown to inevitable violence, that forces the recognition that there is no longer maybe or possibly, but only when and how to survive, that offers enough time to prepare but not enough to escape completely, creating an agonizing limbo of waiting for an attack that you know is coming but cannot predict the exact moment. The warning came too late to prevent it. Organization was already mobilized, equipment already deployed, operators already en route to the location, but early enough to minimally prepare, to transform near-certain death into merely probable death through preparation that could buy precious minutes. Wright, federal investigator Thomas Wright, who had coordinated her previous protection and who had developed a grudging respect for Jake through months working on the case, called Jake's phone at 6:15 on Tuesday evening, exactly as they were finishing a simple dinner at her apartment. Jake saw Wright's name on the screen and immediately felt a stomach drop because Wright didn't call casually, didn't do social media check-ins, only called when there was significant development in a case. And the timing 6:15 on Tuesday, outside of normal working hours, suggested an urgency that transcended routine updates. Right? Jake answered, keeping his voice neutral so as not to alarm her immediately, but already processing through the possibilities. Jake, we have a critical situation. Wright's voice was tense, controlled in a way that suggested he was suppressing urgency to communicate clearly. We intercepted communication from the federal prison where Vance is being held. He ordered a hit on your witness, not a threat or intimidation, a definitive elimination order with a specific timeline and allocated resources. Jake's blood literally froze, his body temperature dropping as adrenaline began flooding his system. Timeline. Tonight, between 8 and midnight, when his intelligence indicates she would be home and vulnerable. Team of 5 professional operators already mobilized through contractors that Vance keeps on retainer. Military-grade equipment, automatic weapons, body armor, breaching charges, communication gear, coordination that suggests joint training, not amateurs improvising. This is a real hit squad, not local thugs. Jake looked at her sitting across the table, still unaware that the world was about to crumble again, and did a quick calculation. He had less than 2 hours before the attack window began. Possibly less if Vance's intelligence was wrong about the timing, or if operators decided to arrive early to establish positions. Backup. I'm mobilizing now, but it will take at least 40 minutes to reach your location, possibly longer, depending on traffic and availability. I'm using every contact I have to speed things up, but the reality is that you're alone for at least the first half hour of any engagement. 40 minutes. An eternity in combat. A lifetime when facing 5 professionals with superior firepower and coordination. Jake processed options in seconds of training developed over 2 decades. Option 1, move immediately. Try to reach a more defensible location, or find backup mid-route. Problem: they didn't know where the attackers were positioned. Moving through the city without knowing if they were being tracked risked ambush in transit where they would have zero cover and multiple vulnerabilities. A car was a death trap against an opponent with automatic weapons. Option 2, fortify the apartment, which wasn't designed for defense against coordinated assault. Use the time they had to establish minimal defensive positions. Wait for backup to arrive while trying to hold off attackers. Problem: the apartment had multiple entrances and windows. The walls were drywall, offering no real protection against rifle rounds. The furnishings offered concealment but not cover. Tactically, it was a nightmare scenario, but less of a nightmare than being caught in the open during movement. Fortifying things here, Jake decided, choosing the option that minimized variables he couldn't control. Send backup as fast as humanly possible. And writes if this goes bad, make sure she testifies anyway, so the case against Vance doesn't fall apart because of a lost witness. Jake, right, Commisso? recognizing key Jake stop essentially writing while. Just make sure, Jake cut in, and hung up before Wright could argue. She turned to him, telling him she'd been observing his side of the conversation with growing concern, that she'd seen his expression shift from neutral to grim, that she knew his body language well enough after months together to know something catastrophic was unfolding. What happened? Vance ordered. A hit on you. Tonight. No sugarcoating, because there was no time and because she deserved the truth. 5 professional operators, military equipment, arriving between now and midnight. Wright is sending backup, but it will take at least 40 minutes to arrive. We need to fortify the apartment and hold until reinforcements arrive. She saw instant terror flood her eyes, not a surprise, because some part of her probably always knew Vance wouldn't let go, but confirmation of her worst fear still. Hitting like a physical blow. Terror not just of imminent death, but of the devastating recognition that months of rebuilding her life, of beginning to hope, of believing the nightmare was over, had been a cruel illusion, that Vance would never let her live, not out of strategy, but out of pure ego. He can't. I've already witnessed it. The case is built. Killing me doesn't change anything. Desperate logic, searching for an escape from reality. It's not about tactics, Jake explained, already. Starting to move through the apartment, mentally cataloging defensive options. It's about his ego, not tolerating that you contributed to his downfall. Pure revenge. And this is happening, so we need to prepare now. But terror was impressively quickly, given the circumstances replaced by something more complex in her expression. Devastating confidence in Jake, mixed with absolute horror that she was putting him in danger again, that his choice to stay and protect could cost him his life this time, that the odds of 5 trained operators versus 1 suspended sheriff were impossible, and that staying meant Jake was potentially choosing to die for her. You should go, she said, words costing everything but offered anyway because she loved him too much to be the reason she died. Call backup and leave. Get somewhere safe. Don't face 5 professionals alone. That's suicide. It's not an option, and you know it. Jake replied with absolute firmness that allowed no argument or negotiation. Already moving through the apartment, assessing defensive positions, with an eye trained by decades of tactical scenarios. And we're not going to waste time arguing. I have less than 2 hours to fortify a location that is a tactical nightmare. To teach you basic defensive protocols, to position us both to survive until backup arrives. He stopped moving, turned to face her directly, and held her shoulders firmly in his hands. I'll do everything in my power to keep you alive until reinforcements arrive, but you need to trust me completely and do exactly what I say when I say it, without questioning or hesitating. Lives depend on following instructions precisely. Understood? It wasn't a romantic request or a gentle suggestion. It was the command of an officer, accustomed to being obeyed in critical situations, born of urgency and necessity and the recognition that survival depended on perfect coordination. And she, seeing absolute certainty in his eyes, mixed with fear that he was trying to hide for her own sake, nodded because the alternative of arguing, freezing, or not cooperating was useless and potentially fatal. Understood, she managed, her voice smaller than she wanted, but steady. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a fundamental difference. A difference that cuts to the very essence of what fear means, and how the body and mind respond, between facing danger as part of a job where training, protocol, and backup create a structure that makes terror manageable, and facing danger where the person you love more than your own life is a specific target, where you are essentially alone against an adversary who so massively surpasses your resources that survival depends not on competence, but on a miracle, where protocol is completely inadequate and desperate improvisation is the only option available. Jake had faced danger countless times in 22 years of law enforcement, guns pointed at his face more times than he could count, hostage situations where miscalculation would mean innocent deaths, violent confrontations where a second of hesitation could be fatal, high-speed chases where physics and luck determined outcomes as much as skill. Over decades, he had developed the ability to operate under extreme pressure, to make tactical decisions when adrenaline was flooding his system, to remain calm and clear when others panicked. But those experiences, however intense and dangerous they were, had occurred within a framework that offered structure. Adrenaline was real, but was managed through training that had rehearsed responses until they became automatic. Backup was called radio away, meaning he was never truly alone, even when physical partners weren't immediately present. Protocol offered a decisional framework that reduced cognitive load during critical moments, and crucially, threats were professional, not personal. They were part of the job, not attacks on his core identity. This was fundamentally different in ways Jake hadn't fully anticipated until Wright revealed that the attack was coming. Sheath, a woman he loved in ways that transcended any previous relationship, who had become not only a romantic partner but the reason his life had meaning beyond badge and duty, was the specific target. The primary objective of the hit squad that had been mobilized specifically to eliminate her. He was essentially alone, backup coming but 40 minutes away, an eternity in combat scenarios, meaning that the first half hour of any engagement would be fought without support, against an adversary that surpassed his resources, not marginally but massively. 5 trained operators versus 1 suspended sheriff. Automatic weapons versus service pistol. Military-grade equipment versus improvised defenses. Coordination of a team that trained together versus solo improvisation. The protocol she had relied on throughout her entire career was completely inadequate for the situation. There was no manual for defending a civilian apartment that wasn't designed for defense against a military-style assault. There was no backup plan beyond hold until reinforcements arrive, which assumed holding was tactically feasible. And there was no extraction route that didn't involve exposing her to greater danger. In the minutes between Wright's call at 6:15 and the first signs of attackers, arriving sounds of vehicles parking outside a building, glimpses through windows of figures moving. With tactical precision, Jake did everything that training, experience, and 2 decades of similar scenarios dictated, operating in a mode that was part panic-suppressed planning and part automatic responses engraved by repetition. She immediately moved her to the most defensible room the apartment offered. A bathroom located in the center of the apartment with no external windows that could be breached. No direct line of sight of entry points. With walls that were admittedly just drywall, but offered at least concealment, if not real ballistic protection. Stay here. Don't leave, no matter what happens, unless I specifically say it's safe. Understood? He barricaded the entrance with heavy furniture, a couch pushed against the door, a table wedged behind it, creating an obstacle that wouldn't prevent entry but would delay it by precious seconds, forcing attackers to make noise, breaching the door, alerting Jake to the timing and location of the attack. He turned off all the lights in the apartment, plunging the interior into darkness that would deny a visual advantage to attackers entering from outside, where ambient light remained, which would give Jake a familiarity advantage of knowing the layout where attackers would have to navigate unknown space. He positioned himself in a location that offered the best combination of cover behind a kitchen counter constructed of materials that might stop pistol rounds, if not rifle rounds, in line of sight to primary entry points. The front door and the sliding glass door of the balcony, which were the most likely breach points. He checked the weapon and ammunition with hands that were steady through force of will, not absence of fear. A service pistol he had carried for years. To spare magazines on his belt, 60 rounds total against opponents with presumably hundreds or thousands. A capacity that meant every shot had to count because there was no ammunition to waste on suppressive fire or mistakes. He processed tactically, with a clarity that was brutally honest, knowing that the odds were horrific in ways that didn't allow for sugarcoating or optimism. 5 against 1 was a numerical disadvantage that no amount of training could completely overcome. Attackers with military equipment, body armor that would absorb pistol rounds. Automatic weapons that delivered a volume of fire that semi-automatic pistols couldn't match had. A firepower advantage that was decisive in sustained engagement. Their coordination, a team that presumably trained together, that had rehearsed assaults, that communicated through tactical radios, versus his improvisation massively favored the attackers. And critically, he had the liability to protect her, not just survive alone. Meaning that his mobility was limited, his tactical options were constrained. He couldn't retreat or maneuver freely, because doing so exposed her. Any objective analysis, any tactical assessment that wasn't clouded by emotion or wishful thinking, said that survival for both was deeply improbable, bordering on impossible. The best realistic strategy was to delay until backup arrived. 40 minutes, that felt like a lifetime, but delaying against 5 determined and well-equipped professionals, for that duration was feasible, only if one accepted the devastating truth that casualties were virtually inevitable, and consciously prioritized which casualties were acceptable. And Jake, making that calculation with a clarity sharpened by fear, not dulled, decided immediately, without hesitation or doubt. If someone died that night, hand odds suggested that someone would be him, not her. He would buy every second of survival for her, with his own body, if necessary. Literally transforming himself into an obstacle that attackers would have to physically remove before reaching her. It wasn't abstract heroism or a romantic gesture that sounded noble but wasn't backed by genuine willingness. It was a concrete, tactical decision born from the brutal recognition that, in his personal calculation, not an objective assessment, but a subjective valuation, that love created his life was worth less than hers. Not because it was worthless, but because losing her was intolerable in ways that losing his own life wasn't. Because a world without her wasn't the world he wanted to exist in. Because if the choice was between his death and her death, there was no choice, only an obvious answer. At 43, after 2 decades facing mortality in various forms, Jake had no illusions of immortality or invincibility that young officers sometimes carried. He knew exactly how bad the situation was, how improbable the odds were of both surviving, how likely it was that the apartment would see violence, resulting in casualties. But she also knew with certainty that transcended doubt or fear that she would attempt the impossible anyway. That she would fight with everything she had, skill developed through decades, determination born of love, willingness to sacrifice that she hadn't fully tested before, that she wouldn't back down or negotiate or prioritize her own safety as long as she needed protection. And when he heard sounds that had been dreading, vehicles with distinctively powerful engines stopping outside the building, doors opening and closing with precision that suggested coordination, multiple footsteps on a stairwell outside the apartment, when he saw, through a tiny gap in the curtain that had cracked for surveillance, figures emerging from vehicles with equipment that confirmed the worst-case scenario. 5 men. Weaponry that caught streetlights in a way that revealed automatic weapons, not handguns, moving with military coordination that demonstrated training. Jake took a deep breath, centered himself using a technique he had learned decades ago for managing adrenaline. Checked his pistol one final time, ensuring the round was chambered and the safety was off, and mentally prepared to do what he had sworn. When he first met her, a promise he had repeated multiple times, but never had to test to its literal extremity. Keep her alive, no matter the cost. Protect her with everything, including his own life if necessary. Comment below. This makes sense to me when you face not an abstract danger, but a specific threat to the person you love. When the odds are so impossible that survival depends on miracles, not skill. When you make the conscious decision that if someone dies, it will be you, not them. Terror is different because it isn't just about your own mortality, but about failing to protect what matters most. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because there is a specific moment in violence where time dilates and compresses simultaneously. where eternity happens in seconds and seconds stretch into forever, where every sensation is amplified to a superhuman level, the sound of an explosion that physically hurts the ears, a flash of light that temporarily blinds, the smell of cordite and pulverized drywall that fills the nose and throat, the metallic taste of fear and adrenaline, and where decisions that would normally take minutes of deliberation are made in fractions of a second based on instinct and training and desperate calculations of how to buy one more second of survival. The attack began at exactly 8:32 p.m., a timing Jake automatically recorded via a glance at a digital microwave clock, the second before the world exploded in violence, with precision that demonstrated professional planning and coordination that left nothing to chance. A small but absolutely deafening explosion at the front door, a breaching charge designed for blow locks and hinges simultaneous, with the sound of windows shattering in the bedroom and living room, multiple entry points being strategically compromised to divide attention between defense and create confusion about where the main threat was coming from. Flashbangs thrown through broken windows, grenades designed to disorient through overwhelming sensory input, creating light so bright that it temporarily blinded, and sounds so loud that it disrupted equilibrium, exploding in succession that was calculated to maximize disorientation, filling the apartment with smoke, noise, and chaos designed to incapacitate resistance before the assault proper began. And through that chaos, 5 figures moved with brutal efficiency, a military unit that had trained together extensively, knew specific roles, and communicated through hand signals and tactical radios. 2 through a front door that had been breached, 1 through a bedroom window, and 2 through a sliding glass door on a balcony that had been shattered, converging on the apartment from multiple directions simultaneously. Jake responded instinctively that it was the product of 2 decades of training and hundreds of similar scenarios where the body moved before the conscious mind finished processing. He returned fire through smoke and darkness towards the front door, where the explosion had backlit figures entering, aiming at the center mass of silhouettes that were briefly visible, not aiming for headshots, which were too precise, but for torsos, which offered the largest target, firing controlled pairs, 2 rapid shots, then a brief pause to assess, then repeat, forcing attackers who were rushing through the doorway to seek cover immediately, instead of executing the rapid room clearing that their training dictated, buying precious seconds that were measured in heartbeats but were the difference between being immediately overwhelmed and having a chance to respond tactically. But the odds became brutally clear within 30 seconds of the initial exchange, when Jake's tactical situation crystallized through smoke. The attackers had not only a numerical superiority of 5 versus 1, but also a decisive equipment advantage: body armor that Jake glimpsed absorbing rounds that should have dropped targets, automatic weapons that delivered a volume of fire that a semi-automatic pistol fundamentally could not match, and coordination where 3 attackers suppressed Jake with sustained fire while 2 maneuvered to flank positions. And after those initial 30 seconds of exchange, after Jake had expended his first magazine 15 rounds that had possibly eliminated a body-based attacker who saw a drop but certainly hadn't stopped advancing, it became horrifyingly clear that his strategy of defending from a fixed position behind the kitchen counter was unsustainable. Attackers were systematically suppressing him with a volume of fire that made returning accurate fire nearly impossible. Were advancing through the apartment using fire and movement tactics that demonstrated professional training, and were inevitably going for his flank positions. So Jake made a decision that was tactically questionable. Any instructor would have said it was reckless, bordering on suicidal, but which was morally unavoidable based on a calculation that wasn't about maximizing his own survival, but about protecting her at any cost. He deliberately left cover, moved aggressively toward the attackers instead of retreating or maintaining a defensive position, and transformed himself into an immediate and present threat that forced their focus entirely on him. Essentially, offering herself as a target was easier and more valuable. An active shooter moving aggressively was a threat. that had to be addressed immediately, versus a hidden defender to protect the real target that was hidden in the bathroom, buying time by drawing fire onto herself. Consciously calculating that making herself the primary target eliminated their search for her. And it worked with an effectiveness that was horrifying because the price was measured in Jake's blood. Attackers concentrated fire entirely on him, automatic weapons tracking his movement, the volume of rounds that filled the air around him being absurd and terrifying. But his movement, aggressive, unpredictable, using furniture and walls for brief concealment, if not real, cover combined with skill developed through decades made him a difficult target, allowing him to eliminate the second attacker with shots that were a product of muscle memory, not conscious aim, then the third, when briefly exposed during reload. But the price was being paid continuously. The first hit caught Jake's left shoulder, a round from an automatic weapon that impacted with force that spun Jake partially around, which should have dropped him through pain and shock. But the adrenaline masked it sufficiently that it maintained function. His left arm immediately became weaker, but still usable. Continued engaging Mesmo through pain, moving through apartment usando knowledge into modo layout Kuata contest. Didn't have, knowing some looking on furniture era, on walls provided concealment. Where angles operation brief advantage, firing calm precision Q was born literally, decades, practice 8-second magazine was empty. 15 more rounds expended Q. Had eliminated third Atacante Besito embody that dropped definitively. But second Hichi Veyuing Legi durate the round Q. Tore through muscly possibly nicked bone-based MW Q. Pain exploded through adrenaline suppression. Ki tore no mobility severely compromised immediately. Q would have dropped, lesser person Maz. Q Jake pushed through pork, stopping meant dying E. Dying meant failing, protect her. 2 remaining attackers, those who had entered through the balcony and had been maneuvering during the firefight, recognized that Jake was wounded and vulnerable. They coordinated to his flank position, revealing that the automatic weapons they carried, with an empty pistol, having fired the last round from the third magazine and compromised mobility, were facing execution in seconds. And it would have ended precisely there. It would have ended with Jake dying on the apartment floor and the attackers then finding her in the bathroom. If backup hadn't arrived 20 minutes earlier, then Wright's estimate not 40 minutes, but 20, because Wright had conveyed urgency so effectively that local units had responded with lights and sirens, because the dispatcher had recognized the criticality, because sometimes luck favors desperate. Sound D new gunfire from entrance, shouts D police. Drop weapons. Distraction momentary Q, forced remaining at a contest. Para, reconsider tactical situation. Para recognize, Q engagement had shifted D simple, hit para complex situation calm. Law enforcement involved. Remaining Atacante was eliminated. Poor backup officer Q entered through breached front door. Clean shot, Q dropped attacker instantly. Last Atacante, recognizing Q situation era untenable, fled a través just shattered window in bedroom, dropping through to ground floor. Escaping M vehicle Q had been left running for precisely a quell contingency. And then silence descended, broken only by ringing in Jake's ears, the product of countless gunshots in enclosed space, and his labored breathing as he tried to maintain consciousness. Through the significant blood loss, the shock his body was entering, and the pain that adrenaline no longer fully masked. Ella emerged, the bathroom on had been following instructions, dealy rigidly. Para remained 8, specifically told, was safe. Maz unable para wait quando, gunfire stopped, E silence, suggested either victory or death, having to know. Which E saw Jake Enda standing somehow, miraculously, impossibly standing, quando should have collapsed. But was standing apenas, through pure force, D will. Bleeding heavily, D shoulder wound, Q had soaked shirt completely, D leg wound Q had pant leg, dark calm, blood. D graze, M side Q hadn't even noticed taking body armor Q had worn before attack, showing multiple impacts. Dimple's M Kevlar on rounds had hit Q would have been instantly fatal without protection. Você está viva, Jake managed. Voice weak Maz, carrying satisfaction. Q transcended pain. Confirmation. Q objective had been achieved. Mesmo Q cost had been devastating. Então collapsed, porque adrenaline que had sustained aim. Finally. Exhausted. Pork body finally acknowledged damage Q had been inflicted. Pork had accomplished what promised E could finally let go. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a devastating moment after surviving violence that should have been fatal, where the relief of being alive brutally collides with the recognition that victory is not complete, that threat persists, that the sacrifice that was made, blood that was spilled, pain that was endured, trauma that will be carried forever bought only temporary reprieve, not permanent safety, and that harder decisions are still coming because the enemy who ordered the attack remains alive and capable of ordering another. While paramedics worked on Jake with an urgency that was controlled but evident, 3 gunshot wounds that individually were serious but collectively were life-threatening through cumulative blood loss, which required immediate intervention to stabilize him before transport to a hospital where multiple surgeries would be necessary. Wright took her aside, away from the chaos of EMTs working and officers securing the scene, for a conversation that she saw in his eyes would be devastating before words were spoken. Will he survive? She asked first, absolute priority, transcending everything else because Jake being alive was a prerequisite for any other consideration. Paramedics say yes if they get to the hospital in the next 15 minutes and if there are no complications during transport, Wright replied, in honesty that was brutal but necessary. The shoulder wound missed major arteries but damaged muscle significantly. The leg wound is through and through, which nicked the femur but didn't shatter. The side graze is superficial comparatively. Body armor saved his life without it. The multiple impacts he suffered would have been fatal. But recovery will take months, not weeks, and permanent limitations are possible. Relief flooding through her, alive. Jake estava livre restaira manageable say that fundamental fact permanecia. Maz Wright's expression hadn't softened, indicating key worse news estava coming. But there's a problem, Wright continued, his voice dropping to the tone that was reserved for delivering information that fundamentally altered situations. We intercepted additional communication from Vance after the attack began. I wasn't monitoring in real time, or we would have intervened earlier. But analysis after the fact revealed conversations that changed the calculus here. What conversations? Terror renewed because it couldn't be good news. Vance referred to this team as first attempt in communication with his associates. Not the attempt or final solution, but specifically first, implying contingency, implying a backup plan if this failed. And given his resources, which are obviously substantial if a mobilized military team is needed for a hit, the safe presumption is that he can try again. Words hit like a physical blow, draining the relief that had barely begun to fill the space where terror had been. So we survived this for what? Wait for the next attack. Live in fear until it eventually succeeds. The system should protect you, Wright said, but his tone carried doubt that undermined his words. Maximum security, complete isolation of him, monitoring of all communications. But he hesitated, recognizing that his next words crossed the line of what the federal investigator should say. The system has already failed. Multiple times. This attack happened despite Vance being in federal custody, despite monitoring, despite protocols. His resources dramatically exceeded our estimates. It was a brutal reality settling in through shock and adrenaline crash. They had survived the battle. Jake had taken 3 bullets, protecting her. Had fought impossible odds. Had literally transformed his own body into a barrier between her and death but hadn't won the war. Vance remained alive, remained connected, remained motivated by ego and revenge that transcended rationality. And everything Jake had sacrificed, a career already damaged beyond repair through previous decisions, A body now carrying wounds that would never fully heal. Peace of mind that would be shattered permanently, had bought only time, a temporary reprieve, a delay, not resolution. How long until he can mobilize another attempt? A practical question born from the need to understand the timeline, to know how much breathing room existed. Weeks, possibly months, Wright estimated. This attack required substantial planning, a mobilizing team, and coordination. It's not something that happens overnight, but it's also not something that wouldn't happen. Vance demonstrated capability and willingness. To assume he won't try again would be dangerously naive. He looked at Jake being loaded with gurney, at the blood that stained the apartment floor, at the destruction that the firefight had created, and felt something shift internally. Not fear, but anger. Not despair, but determination born from the recognition that passivity was a death sentence installment plan. So, what do we do? Not a rhetorical question, but a demand for options, for pathways that lead to actual resolution. Not endless deferral. Wright hesitated. Nova Mage, internal conflict, visible pork answer queue. When Adar was an answer queue, badge permission. System will increase protection, will transfer vans, para higher security, will monitor more closely, officially, and what posso offer, e what deveria be sufficient. E unofficially, pushing because she sensed there was more. That Wright was struggling with the same recognition she was reaching, that conventional solutions had failed repeatedly, that Vance was a threat that the system couldn't neutralize adequately. Unofficially. Wright chose his words carefully. There are solutions that the system doesn't allow, but that necessity sometimes dictates. Solutions that would require crossing lines that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Solutions that would transform you or Jake from defending victims into something else entirely. Understood's immediate implication, eliminating Vance, not through a legal system that had proven inadequate, but through extra-legal means. Assassination, not prosecution. Vigilante justice, not law enforcement. It was a line she had never considered crossing, that everything, upbringing and values resisted, that would fundamentally transform her. But it was also a settling recognition that some threats couldn't be managed, just eliminated. That Vance being alive was a permanent Damocles sword over her and Jake's existence, that the next attack might not be survived. I can't have this conversation, Wright said, stepping back physically and metaphorically. As a federal investigator, I have an obligation to uphold the law, but as someone who saw Jake take 3 bullets protecting you, who recognizes that the system failed you repeatedly, who understands that some enemies are relentless. He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. Era choice Q was being laid onto her now explicitly but clearly. Except endless cycle de threat e defense, live in fear at Tevon's eventually. Succeeded OU, crossline Q, would haunt Ma's Q, would end threat permanently. Watching Jake being carried out in gurney, seeing his blood that had been spilled protecting her. Recognizing that if she remained alive, then his sacrifice was merely a postponement, not a resolution, felt something crystallize, not a decision yet, but an understanding that a decision was coming, that a harder moral calculus than any she had faced was approaching. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When you survive an attack that should have been fatal, but discover that victory is only temporary, that the enemy remains capable of trying again, that the sacrifice made, bought, reprieve, not resolution, forced confrontation, if some threats require crossing moral lines that the system does not allow, but necessity dictates. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moral conflict that comes not from a hypothetical situation discussed in an ethics classroom, but from lying in a hospital bed with 3 bullet wounds that are physical evidence of how profoundly the system has failed. From confronting the reality that the threat persists despite having literally bled defending against it. from the brutal recognition that the choices one faces are between violating everything one believed during one's entire career, or accepting that the person one loves remains in mortal danger that will probably eventually succeed. During Jake's first days of recovery in the hospital after multiple surgeries that repaired damage to his shoulder and leg wounds, after transfusions that replaced blood loss that had nearly been fatal, after stabilization that transformed his condition from critical to serious but manageable, while his body slowly began a healing process that doctors warned would take at least 6 months before approaching anything resembling normality, Jake faced not only constant, grinding physical pain, but also a moral conflict that was new and devastating even after 2 decades in law enforcement. Conflict was not abstract. It was visceral, immediate, carved into his consciousness through the pain that each movement triggered. Vance was in federal prison. He was in custody, which was theoretically secure. The legal system should have dealt with him through proper channels trial that was scheduled. Sentencing that was inevitable given the weight of evidence. Incarceration that should have neutralized the threat to him permanently. But the system had failed, repeatedly and catastrophically, to protect her. 2 previous assassination attempts had nearly succeeded. Supposedly secure communications had been compromised. And now, most damningly, a hit squad of military-grade personnel had been mobilized while Vance was in federal custody, supposedly under monitoring, proving that his resources extended beyond prison walls in ways that the system either couldn't or wouldn't adequately address. Vance had proven his ability to order arrest hits with terrifying effectiveness, had demonstrated that detention did not eliminate the threat from him, only delayed it, and the odds of a future attempt were not merely possible but virtually certain based on communications that Wright had intercepted referencing first attempt, implying contingencies. And that recognition created a split in Jake's moral framework that was tearing him apart with a force that rivaled physical pain. Part of him, the part that had been trained for 22 years to always operate within the law, that had sworn oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law, that had built an entire identity on the distinction between those who operated within the system and criminals who operated outside, said that murdering Vance in prison was a line that fundamentally he could not cross, because it wasn't just about legality, but about identity. Jake had always been someone who followed rules, even when they were inconvenient, who worked within the system even when it was flawed, who distinguished himself from criminals through adherence to principles, not merely outcomes. Killing Vance because that's what he was contemplating for hours, lying awake in a hospital bed, processing, eliminating the threat permanently through extra-legal means, would violate everything he believed in, would transform him from protector to assassin, would make him no better than the criminals he had fought during his career, would destroy the last vestige of his identity as a law enforcement officer, even if his badge was already gone. Practical reality era Q attempting Aquilo would almost certainly fail. Vance is starving fitted out custody con security that apes or D having been inadequate, para-prevent communications out. Would be formidable barrier para-attack in failure, would result M. Jake being imprisoned alongside criminals Q had arrested. M becoming everything Q had fought against, but the greater part of Jack the Pot that had seen her nearly die multiple times, that had taken 3 bullets, specifically protecting her with the conscious decision that his life was an acceptable price. That knew viscerally, in a way that transcended abstract reasoning, that the next attempt could succeed where this one had failed. That recognized that being present to protect her again wasn't guaranteed, given the injuries she had sustained. Argued with overwhelming force that some threats were so relentless, so resourceful, so fundamentally unneutralizable through conventional means, that extraordinary methods were not only justified, but necessary. Vance wasn't criminal common Q, could be rehabilitated, OU contained. Era threat existential Q, had resources para operate de perso. Q had motivation, nestida de ego, Q transcended rationality, Q had demonstrated repeatedly, Q wouldn't stop. 8 succeeded. E waiting para next attempt. Trusting system Q had failed repeatedly. Accepting passivity M faced a threat virtually certain. Era choosing her death through inaction. The math was brutal. Jake alive, but Vance also alive, meant an eventual attempt that might succeed. Jake's sacrifice of taking bullets had bought time, not safety. And if Jake could eliminate Vance through means that would destroy his soul, that would violate everything, that would fundamentally transform him, then his sacrifice would have permanent meaning, would actually resolve the threat instead of merely postponing it. It was a trolley problem in real life. Pull the lever and kill one person actively and become a murderer. Or don't pull the lever and allow the system to fail, eventually resulting in their death through passivity. Choose between damnation through action or damnation through inaction. She visited the hospital on the 3rd day after the attack. After Jake had regained enough consciousness for coherent conversation, after the initial crisis had passed, but before he had been discharged. She walked into the room and immediately saw, in his expression, not physical pain, but internal conflict what he was contemplating. "You're thinking of doing something irreversible," she said. Not a question, but a statement born from knowing him well enough to read war in his eyes. "The system failed," Jake replied, his voice weakened by pain, but his conviction clear. "Vance will try again. It's certain, not a possibility. And next time I might not be. Their doctors say recovery will take months. I might not have the mobility I had before. I might be there, but it won't be enough. 3 bullets almost wasn't enough. Next time it might require a sacrifice that actually kills me, and then you're alone against a threat that won't stop. So what's the solution?" He challenged him to articulate what they both knew he was considering. "Do you assassinate him in prison? Do you cross every line you've spent your career defending? Do you become exactly what you've always fought against?" "It's not about me," Jake insisted, but his conviction was wavering because she had hit the core of the conflict. "It's about ending the threat. It's about making sacrifices that actually mean something permanent, instead of just a postponement. It's about you," she countered, moving closer, taking his hand carefully, avoiding the 4 lines. "Because you're contemplating destroying whoever is meant to save me. You're offering a sacrifice that isn't just physical, but moral, spiritual. And I can't accept that. I won't be the reason you lose your soul. And I can't accept leaving you in danger," Jake replied, desperation bleeding through. "Cannot live with the knowledge that the threat persists, that the next attack is coming, that I can prevent it through action, even if that action costs everything. I've already taken 3 bullets. What's soul compared to your life?" "Everything," she whispered. "Because I love the Jake who took bullets, who sacrificed his career, who chose me repeatedly as a person of principles. Remove principles, and the person I love doesn't exist anymore. Just a shell that looks like him but isn't. And I don't want that. I prefer risk to certainty of losing who you are, adding passy, same resolution." Conflict Q had no answer, correct pork, both positions had legitimacy. Jake's argument Q threat had para be eliminated. Estava grounded M reality, D having experienced inadequacy, the system firsthand. Her argument Q crossing Linha would destroy him. Estava grounded M understanding, DQ identity era. Inseparable to principles. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because there is a specific transformation that happens in a relationship when the dynamic fundamentally shifts from one person being passively protected to both people simultaneously recognizing that each values the other's life more than their own. When vulnerability ceases to be unidirectional and becomes mutual revelation, when the person who was always strong and protective is forced through injury to accept care and dependence, revealing layers of humanity that heroism had obscured. During Jake's weeks of recovery that stretched into months, a series of surgeries that progressively repaired damage but couldn't fully restore it. Physical therapy, that was an excruciating process of relearning movements his body had executed automatically for decades. Constant pain that became an unwelcome companion, disrupting sleep and limiting mobility. Serving as a permanent reminder of night, when he had chosen to literally transform his body into a barrier, their relationship transformed again in ways neither had fully anticipated. She didn't leave Jake to face recovery alone, even when the temptation to retreat arose. Because watching the person you love in constant pain is its own form of torture. Because the helplessness of not being able to fix it is devastating. Because part of her felt crushing guilt that his wounds were the price of protecting her. She moved temporarily to his apartment, the small, one-bedroom that Jake had rented after leaving cabin. A space that was modest, but now felt claustrophobic when filled with medical equipment and limitations to help with daily tasks that injuries made difficult or impossible. She became a caregiver, as well as a partner, learning through necessity how to change bandages that covered wounds, how to assist with mobility when leg injury made walking without support dangerous, how to manage pain medication that was potent but necessary, how to recognize signs of infection that surgeries always risked, and how to provide emotional support through the frustration that Jake felt in being dependent. And Jake, forced by circumstance to accept help and vulnerability that he had never allowed in previous relationships or life, because he had always been a protector, a provider, a person others depended on, not a person who needed dependence, learned a lesson that was humbling and transformative. Strength was not only the capacity to protect others but also the capacity to allow oneself to be protected, to accept care without seeing it as weakness, to recognize that interdependence did not diminish but enriched connection. Foi hali reverso, kiwas initially uncomfortable parable JQ had always been active, independent, capable, struggling, calm basic tasks, como, dressing, self-quando, shoulder injury, limited range, demotion. Como, bathing, quando, mobility was compromised. Como, sleeping, quando pain, made finding comfortable position nearly impossible. Pride Q had been cultivated at travers the decades to self-sufficiency, resisting need, para-help, temptation, para-minimize, pain, OU, difficulty, para-avoid, burdening her, and she, who had been a person being protected, was now a person providing protection of a different sort, not against external threats, but against internal vulnerability, isolation, and despair that chronic pain and limited mobility could induce. Learning when to push him through physical therapy, which was necessary but agonizing, versus when to allow the rest his body needed. When to offer sympathy versus when to provide the tough love that recovery required. You almost died for me, she said one night during a particularly bad pain episode, weeks after surgeries when healing should have been progressing, but when setback minor had triggered infection requiring antibiotics and additional intervention. When Jake was lying in bed, unable to sleep due to pain that medication wasn't adequately controlling, frustration visible in every tense line of his body. I took 3 bullets that were literally meant for me, wounds that carry mine, that you intercepted with your own body, and watch you suffering through recovery. Knowing that each spike of pain is because it protected me, is torture that has no name. I would do it again. Jake replied without hesitation, even through pain, a conviction that was unshaken, despite the cost being paid daily. Infinite times, without changing my mind. Because the alternative, you taking those pills, you lying in the hospital, or worse, is unbearable in ways that physical pain isn't. Life without you isn't the life I want. It's existence that would be hollow. And what about a life where you die protecting me? She challenged, a question she had been building up during weeks of watching him suffer. Is this a life I can accept? Waking up each day, knowing that my last breath cost you yours. Living with the knowledge that the person I loved sacrificed everything to save me. That's not a gift, Jake. It's a curse that will haunt me forever. It was a question without a simple answer. A paradox that highlighted the fundamental tension in what had happened. Jake's decision to take bullets. to transform his body into a shield, was simultaneously the greatest demonstration of love conceivable, and the most terrifying revelation, because it proved that he valued her life infinitely more than his own, that his calculation did not even hesitate in choosing sacrifice. "You would have done the same," Jake pointed out, a truth they both recognized. "If the positions were reversed, if you were with the gun and I was in danger, you would have made the same choice. You know yourself well enough to know that." Era true, devastatingly true. Ella would have sacrificed some hesitation, say protecting him required Aquilo, would have made same calculation Q life deli mattered more, would have transformed self M barrier mesimo Q meant death. "So, they're both idiots," she said, attempting a levity that didn't quite land, because tears were threatening. "Both valuing the other more than themselves. Both willing to sacrifice, both incapable of accepting the loss of the other. It's a recipe for mutual destruction, trying to protect each other. Either it's the foundation of love that's real," Jake countered, reaching for her hand with a movement that caused visible wince of pain, but that completed anyway. "Because if both value each other above self, if both are willing to sacrifice, then both understand the depth of commitment. It's not about who dies protecting whom. It's about both choosing to be together, knowing that some things matter more than individual survival." It was a recognition of interdependence that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Both would have sacrificed for the other without hesitation. Both valued the other's life more than their own, and that mutual recognition was not romantic abstraction but literal truth, proven through blood, bullets, and scars that marked Jake's body permanently. "I can't lose you," she whispered, her vulnerability absolute. "Not after watching how much it costs you protecting me. Not after seeing who you are when every defense is stripped away. I need you alive, not just for myself, but because the world needs people who make the choices you made, who value others above themselves, who demonstrate that heroism isn't performance, but conscious choice. Made repeatedly. And I can't lose you," Jake echoed, "because I discovered in protecting you that life has meaning beyond badges and duties. That connection with the person who truly knows you, all your flaws, fears, and vulnerabilities is worth any cost, including your own life." It was a mutual declaration that was simultaneously a long-term commitment and a recognition of fragility, both valuing the other absolutely, both willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, both terrified of losing the other, both choosing to stay together despite knowing that choosing the other increased stakes because losing them would be devastating beyond what losing themselves would be. And that deepening through weeks of recovery, her caring for him in his most vulnerable states. Jake accepting care without retreating behind pride, both learning that strength included not only the capacity to protect, but also the capacity to accept being protected, revealed a fundamental truth. Their love wasn't a product of trauma that would fade when the trauma receded, wasn't based on roles of protector and protected that would dissolve when circumstances changed. It was a genuine partnership born from mutual recognition of complete humanity, strength and weakness, courage and fear, capability and vulnerability that had been tested through literal fire and bullets, and had not only survived, but had deepened through that testing. Comment below. This makes sense to me when the person who was always protected is forced through injury to accept care, when both recognize simultaneously that each values the other's life more than their own. When interdependence reveals that love isn't about roles, but about mutual choice to value the other absolutely, even when that means accepting the terrifying vulnerability of potentially losing them. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a fundamental difference between resolution that comes through crossing moral lines that destroy who you are versus resolution that comes through working systems in creative ways that preserve principles while achieving the necessary objective. Between choosing damnation through action that violates everything versus finding a path that is imperfect but allows living with oneself afterward. between heroism that costs one's soul versus competence that navigates complexity without sacrificing humanity. The resolution to Vance's threat came not through Jake violating the moral code he had defended throughout his career, not through crossing a line that would have transformed him from protector to assassin, not through a choice that would have destroyed his own identity while protecting her life. It came through right working within the system in ways that Jake, consumed by physical pain, moral conflict, and desperate urgency, had not fully considered or believed were possible given his repeated previous failures. Right after a conversation with her in the hospital where he had implicitly laid out the option of eliminating Vance extra-legally, after seeing horror in her eyes when she understood what he was suggesting, after recognizing that pushing Jake or her toward that path would be destroying precisely what he was trying to save, made a different decision, worked the system harder, more creatively, with less regard for bureaucratic niceties and more focus on achieving the objective through means that were technically legal even if they were pushing property boundaries. The first step was transferring Vance from the federal prison where he was being held to a maximum security facility that had protocols for inmates considered the highest threat, not just to others, but to society through the connections he maintained. The transfer was not a simple administrative process, but required building a case that Vance represented an ongoing threat even from custody, that his communications had resulted in attempted violence, and that standard incarceration was inadequate. Wright used intercepted communications, both those that preceded the hit squad attack, and additional ones that continued monitoring revealed. After the attack failed to build a dossier, demonstrating that Vance maintained an extensive network, even from prison, that he had resources for order violence, and that he represented a threat that transcended normal inmate. The second step was complete isolation, a supermax facility where Vance would be held in administrative segregation, 23 hours a day, where communications with the outside world would be almost completely eliminated through constant monitoring and severe restrictions on visits, phone calls, and email, and where his ability to coordinate through intermediaries would be reduced to nearly zero. It wasn't a complete elimination of the threat, because resources like Vance had didn't simply disappear through transfer and isolate. Anemone remained, connections remained, the will for revenge remained. But it was substantial. Mitigation that transformed the threat from imminent and highly capable to distant and significantly constrained. The third step, crucial for ensuring that mitigation was permanent and not temporary, was constructing an additional federal case based on communications that monitoring had revealed. Vance had violated multiple federal laws through ordering hit custodial conspiracy to commit murder, using interstate communications to facilitate crime, continuing criminal enterprise arrest teach, carrying out a sentencing that was substantial. Wright worked with prosecutors to build an ironclad case, using not only intercepted communications but also testimony from a surviving attacker who had been captured, the last member of the hit squad who had fled but was subsequently located and arrested, and who, facing a life sentence himself, chose to cooperate in exchange for a deal to prove a direct connection between Vance's orders and the attack that had occurred. The trial of that case took months to organize, but when it finally happened, the result was additional sentencing that extended Vance's incarceration for decades beyond his original sentence. This ensured that even with parole considerations, he would not be free until he was an old man, without resources or connections that he currently maintained, which effectively was a life sentence, even if not technically labeled as such. The threat was not permanently eliminated in the way that Vance's death would have, provided there always remained a theoretical possibility that his resources could mobilize something, that his successor in the organization could continue the vendetta, that years in the future circumstances could change. But it was mitigated sufficiently that a relatively normal life was possible, that the constant terror of imminent attack could yield to manageable background vigilance, that daily choices did not have to be dominated by fear. Jake recovered from his injuries through a process that was slow and painful but eventually complete, Within the limitations that doctors had warned, his shoulder had healed, but with a permanently reduced range of motion, never fully recovering the flexibility that had existed, making activities that required reaching overhead or bearing weight on that side difficult. The leg had healed, but with residual weakness that made running impossible and standing for extended periods tiring, which required continuing physical therapy to maintain strength, which occasionally in cold weather or after exertion triggered pain that was reminiscent of a bullet that had partially shattered the bone. Side graze had healed with scarring that was visible but superficial, more of a cosmetic than a functional limitation. A visual reminder of the night when his body had been a barrier, but not an impaired capability. He eventually returned to law enforcement after his suspension ended 6 months that had been extended for recovery, but which the system had allowed to count towards hospital and rehab time, implicitly acknowledging that the circumstances had been extraordinary. But his return was not to his former position as sheriff or to patrol duty, as injuries made it impractical. Instead, he was assigned to the training division, where his experience could be used to teach newer officers, where physical limitations were less consequential, where he could contribute without requiring physical capabilities he no longer fully possessed. It was a different role, an adjustment that required accepting that his chapter as an active field officer was closed, but it was also a continuation of service that mattered, which allowed maintaining a connection to the work that had defined him, even if his form was changed. She continued rebuilding her life, resuming her career as a nurse in a hospital where her competence was recognized, not overshadowed by notoriety as a witness, establishing routines that felt progressively more normal, even if never completely ordinary, developing friendships that were based on present, not past, trauma, but with the acceptance that normality would always be qualified by the knowledge of what had happened. There would always be an element of residual vigilance that never completely disappeared, habitually checking surroundings, instinctively noting exits, maintaining awareness that was a product of having survived multiple threats that should have been fatal. With Jake by her side, she had the strength to live through it, to accept that perfect safety was an illusion everyone had, but that most had never been shattered so brutally, to recognize that choosing to live fully despite awareness of vulnerability was a form of courage. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a permanent transformation that happens when a relationship is tested not through trivial incompatibilities or disagreements about the future, but through a literal life and death scenario, where one person physically intercepts bullets meant for another, where the abstraction of would die for you becomes the concrete reality of blood, wounds, and permanent scars, where the recognition, not intellectual, but visceral, that commitment transcends everything, including self-preservation, and that transformation is not something that fades when immediate danger passes, but is knowledge that fundamentally reshapes how they live each day afterward. Because there is a devastating difference that cuts to the core of what love means and costs between knowing abstractly that someone claims to love you, that they say beautiful words about commitment and devotion, that they make promises about being there through anything, and witnessing concretely in a moment of absolute terror that they are genuinely, literally willing to die for you. That they will do that not in a hypothetical romantic declaration but in a literal decision made in a split second where their body becomes a physical barrier between you and imminent death. Jake hadn't just said during months of their relationship that she mattered more than his life, that he would choose her over his own safety, that he would do anything to protect her. He had proven those words through undeniable actions, taking 3 bullets meant for her. Each impact that partially absorbed body armor but still transmitted brutal force. Each wound that penetrated and caused lasting damage, facing 5 professional assassins alone when the odds were impossible and any rational analysis said survival was improbable. Through consciously choosing not in a moment of panic where instinct overrode thought, but through calculated decision-making where he processed options and selected deliberately, he understood that if someone died that night, it would be him while she needed protection. that his life was an acceptable price for buying seconds of survival for her, that transforming his body into an obstacle was a tactic that sacrificed himself to preserve her. And during months of watching Jake slowly recover from injuries that individually were serious but collectively should have been fatal, that should have resulted in death through blood loss or shock or infection, but that somehow through a combination of medical intervention and his own will had survived, understood the absolutely terrifying depth of his commitment. It wasn't a casual promise that could be withdrawn when convenient. It wasn't romantic sentiment that could fade when the intensity of the circumstance diminished. It wasn't a performance of heroism that was about ego or recognition. It was the fundamental truth of who Jake was at the core of his identity, person for whom protecting those he valued transcended self-preservation completely, who, if circumstance demanded, choosing between his own life and hers, would not hesitate, would not debate, would simply sacrifice because the calculation was automatic and inevitable. And that understanding was simultaneously the most profound demonstration of love she could conceive and the most terrifying recognition she had ever confronted, because it meant that Jake valued her life infinitely more than her own. That in any future scenario where a choice presented itself, she would make the same decision, that loving him meant permanently accepting that she could lose him through sacrifice, which she couldn't prevent because it was core to who she was. Specific threat was mitigated by transferring him to Supermax and placing him in complete isolation, along with additional sentencing that effectively amounted to life imprisonment. His resources were constrained, his ability to coordinate was severely limited, and immediate danger had receded into a manageable background possibility, which was manageable through reasonable surveillance, not constant terror. Jake's injuries were healing within limitations that doctors had established: shoulder with permanently reduced range of motion, leg with residual weakness, physical scars that were visible reminders but weren't debilitating, capacity for function that was diminished but sufficient for life that he had adapted to accommodate. But now, with the immediate crisis resolved and physical recovery progressing, they faced a different challenge that was in many ways more complex than surviving the attack had been. Living each day with the constant knowledge that their love had been tested, in the most brutal way conceivable, a test that had proven its absolute depth, but had also revealed the terrifying reality of their mutual willingness to sacrifice. Jake had literally almost died, not almost in the abstract sense of a close call, but almost in the sense of paramedics fighting to stabilize him, surgeons repairing extensive damage, and days in the ICU where the outcome was uncertain. And the next time, if the threat resurfaced, if a different enemy emerged, if circumstances demanded protection again, he might not be survivable, might result in death that was permanent, not injury that was recoverable. Choosing to be together, choosing to continue the relationship knowing that, meant permanently accepting that they could lose each other, not through natural causes that everyone faces, but through deliberate violence, through conscious sacrifice, through decisions that either would make to protect the other without hesitation. Era awareness que transformou fundamentalmente como lived. Ella couldn't watch Jake leave para work, Sem flashed a memory de seeing him bleeding. Couldn't hear sudden noise, some instant spike to adrenaline remembering attack. Couldn't fully relax mesmo em moments que should have been peaceful, porque knowledge de vulnerability era permanent. Jake carried not only physical scars but also a psychological awareness that the next time protecting her might require ultimate sacrifice, that the wounds he carried were the price of success, but that the next scenario might demand a price that was final. That choosing to be with her meant accepting the recurring possibility of facing situations where his calculation would be identical, her life valued above his own. It wasn't something that therapy could resolve or that time would fully heal. It was a fundamental alteration of the relationship where both understood viscerally, not abstractly, that commitment was literal. That would die for you wasn't romantic hyperbole, but was a statement of fact proven through blood. That choosing each other meant choosing vulnerability profound, because losing each other would be devastation beyond what losing oneself would be. But it also meant that their relationship had a depth that most never achieve. That it had been tested in a forge of literal fire and bullets, and had emerged not broken but strengthened. That the trust between them was absolute because it had been proven in the most extreme circumstances conceivable. That their love was real in ways that transcended convenience or compatibility or any superficial metric. Era relationship Q was simultaneously blessed through having survived impossible. E cursed through knowing exactamente. O Q, survival had cost E, might cost again. Q was foundation sólida, because era built in choices conscientes, made repeatedly através de circumstances devastating. EQ was future uncertain pork. Choosing AO outro meant accepting ongoing vulnerability. Q never fully disappeared. If you've made it this far with me, if you've felt every second of this journey where a coordinated attack transformed an apartment into a war zone, where Jake literally turned his body into a barrier between her and death by taking 3 bullets meant for her, where you witnessed not the romantic abstraction of would die for you, but the concrete reality of a person consciously choosing to sacrifice their own life to buy seconds of survival for their loved one, then you know this story is about something much deeper than romance, born in danger. It's about understanding that some demonstrations of love don't come through pretty words or romantic gestures, but through blood and bullets and decisions made in split seconds that reveal the absolute depth of commitment. It's about recognizing that loving someone who would make that sacrifice means permanently accepting the terrifying vulnerability of potentially losing them through choices they would make again without hesitation. And look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if you want to continue exploring these journeys where people prove love, not through promises, but through actions that cost everything, where relationships are tested in the most brutal ways conceivable and emerge not broken but fundamentally transformed, where choosing to be together means accepting both the blessing of absolute trust and the curse of knowing exactly what commitment can eventually cost, then signing up here is the way to continue walking with me. Because I create each script thinking of you, who understands that the deepest connections are those that have been tested through literal fire, that have been proven through real sacrifice, that continue not despite knowing the cost, but because the cost reveals exactly how real love is. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I want to know that you're here, that Jake, taking 3 bullets and transforming his body into a shield, resonated with you. That you understood that devastating moment when she saw him still standing but bleeding from multiple wounds that should have been fatal, and recognized the terrifying depth of his commitment. That you understood the paradox of a relationship that is simultaneously blessed through having survived the impossible and cursed, through knowing permanently that the next time sacrifice could be ultimate. Your comments tell me that it's worth investing in exploring the nuances of how love is proven, not through words, but through a willingness for literal sacrifice. How living with knowledge of that willingness fundamentally transforms the relationship. How choosing to be together after that means accepting a profound vulnerability that never completely disappears. And if this touched you in any way, if you've ever witnessed someone risking everything to protect you, if you understood that recognition that the person you love values your life more than their own, and that is simultaneously the most beautiful and terrifying truth, if you understood that some relationships are forged in such extreme circumstances that their depth transcends anything that normality could create, leave a like so I know. It's not about numbers. It's about knowing that what I create reaches you on the other side and touches something real. Something that makes you think about your own connections, about people who would make sacrifices for you, about the devastating difference between abstractly knowing that someone loves you and concretely witnessing that they are willing to die, proving it. And because I know you don't want this story to end here, because stories like this demand continuation, demand to see how Jake and she navigate life after that, how their relationship evolves when it's no longer in crisis mode, but in the reality of living each day with knowledge of what happened and what could happen again. How love that was tested so brutally either deepens into something transcendent or fractures under the weight of trauma and vulnerability. There's a video here that continues in the same vein. Click and follow me there. Their journey of transforming from people who survived the impossible into people who build a life together, carrying permanent knowledge of sacrifice, is only beginning. Our journey together continues too. Until the next chapter.